When you formed the company, what was the problem you were trying to solve?
People are flying from other countries to get the best surgeons, best surgical teams, and people would turn to me once they're under anesthesia and be like, hey, Justin, can you Google real quick what to do? Like, we haven't done this before. We haven't done this in a while. I'm like, what is going on here? This is insane.
Is it Barad? How do
Barad.
Barad. Good.
Like the seventh plague.
Yes, got it.
I don't know.
Yes, we do. Yes. Good. Nice job.
I got a vibe.
You got a vibe. I'll do a brief intro and then I'll introduce you. I'll ask you to introduce yourself, and then I got 6 or 7 questions. We'll go through them. We'll see where it takes us. We'll have a little bit of a conversation.
I'm not going anywhere. I live here now.
Awesome. Hello, welcome to another episode of Solve, Syllable's second podcast. Today we are taping live. Well, we are live, but we're taping. So are we really live? It's an existential question I'm not sure I want to get into right now, but we are at Health in Las Vegas, and I am thrilled to have with me today, who I think is going to be my first clinician on the podcast, is Justin Barad, Dr. Justin Barad, and not just doctor, but Justin Barad MD, who is the CEO of Osso VR. Justin, with that as an introduction, welcome to the podcast.
Wow, you just took me on a journey there. Well, I'm back.
Right.
And yeah, I think we're live, but I'm not sure anymore after that, but thank you for having me.
It's absolutely a pleasure to have you. So I'm serious. You are the first clinician that I've actually had on the podcast, and I've been looking forward to talking to you for a while because you're representing a space in terms of how do you bring innovation to medical education that I don't think, certainly in a conference like this, gets the spotlight that it really should. There are a lot of challenges in medical education. I went through the period where the accrediting bodies were starting to talk about work hours, and I went through the first institution of work hours, and I can tell you my colleagues and those that were more senior than I were complaining that people just aren't going to get enough touches, and what is the quality, what is the competence of these clinicians that we're going to be turning out in a work hour era. So we're going to get into a little bit of that, but first, before we do that, just want to establish your bona fides. You're a pediatric orthopedic surgeon.
That's correct.
What drew you to orthopedics and pediatric orthopedics in particular?
Well, my background is in biomedical engineering, so it's a specialty where I can actually apply what I learned in sort of mechanical principles and engineering principles and help people. I've always been really into technology. It's like a big part of my story, so it involves a lot of technology within orthopedics. And pediatric orthopedics in particular, I really got turned on to the idea of mission-based work. And I'd like to tell a little bit of a story that was kind of like really what set me on that path. I would say maybe 2 stories. 2 stories, okay?
Sure.
The first story, did you ever see the movie Gattaca?
Yes.
So, in Gattaca, like, the main character is trying to, like, basically look like this other guy and impersonate him. And part of the issue is he's shorter. So in the movie, and this takes place, like, in the future, this sort of, like, alternate post-apocalyptic future, they do, like, a procedure and, like, saw his leg to make him taller. And at the time, I'm like, movies are crazy, science fiction. The very first surgery I ever did in pediatric orthopedics was distraction osteogenesis, which is leg lengthening. And I'm like, oh my God, I didn't realize, like, everyone thought I was like crazy because in the operating room that day, I was like, this is the Gattaca surgery. And they're like, okay, buddy, we do this like every day.
And just so people who are listening to this understands what that is in English, if I essentially remember it correctly, you basically insert an erector set and fracture the long bones, and then over time you expand and lengthen the legs. Is that, there might be a better way to describe it?
Yeah, so that's probably the most common way. You have an external fixation frame which looks like an erector set, and then you do osteotomy, or basically break the bone in a controlled manner, and then just stretch it out over time as it heals and makes people taller. There are now ways to do that internally, internal distraction. You have to be skeletally mature for that, but those technologies are amazing. So that was one thing where I'm like, okay, this is like magic.
Yeah.
But the other story, which really I cry every time I think about it, so pardon me if I tear up for this. So I was working in Shriners Hospital for Children. There's a kid from Liberia who came in, and he was born with a club foot that was untreated. So, you never see this in the U.S. because it's treated when you're an infant. But he had never had it taken care of, so he's walking basically on his tibias, and his feet are turned in. It's very painful and cosmetically very disfiguring. So we did like a salvage procedure to sort of get his foot back under his ankle. A few weeks later, I was walking in, and I could just sort of see him out of the corner of my eye. And I saw him kind of like yank on his dad's shirt, and he went, "Hey, dad, that's the guy that made it so I could walk again."
Oh my God.
Yeah, and I like
Yeah.
sobbed
Yeah.
uncontrollably.
Oh my God.
And that's when I realized like I wanted to wake up every day and be a part of something bigger than me, right? Like that was the first time I really felt like I'd helped someone out of the kindness of my heart. And I was working with a bunch of other people that wanted to do the exact same thing. And nobody cared about money or other priorities or their own ego and stuff. I mean, sure, that stuff is floating around, but the most important thing was this mission of helping children. And so I knew that for the rest of my life, whatever I did, whether it was pediatric orthopedics or what I'm doing now at Osso, that it would be mission first.
So you've completely left clinical practice and now you're 100% time invested in Osso?
Not exactly. So if we can go back further, maybe I could tell a little bit more of the story. So I actually started out wanting to be a video game developer. So I still love video games. I play them in a little more reasonable number of hours today. But, I wanted to create video games. So I taught myself to program. I got a job at Activision while I was in high school, and I have a game credit with them, which I'm still really proud of, for a game no one's ever heard of because they're really old now. Then I had a family member kind of get ill and hospitalized, and as a lot of us in medicine do. And it was a wake-up call for me. And I was like, how can I help? How can I help my family or other people in similar situations? And I'm like, well, I'm really passionate about technology and gaming. Maybe I could use these skills that I've developed, not for entertainment, but to help people. And so that's when I studied biomedical engineering, and I really wanted to create new technology, but I didn't know how. And so I was asking around, I was talking to this gastroenterologist, and he told me, Justin, if you want to invent something, you need to understand the problem you're trying to solve first. And he thought a great way to understand medical problems was to be a doctor. So I took his advice way too literally and, went to UCLA, and then I did my ortho residency. And then it was in residency that I started experiencing sort of this challenge that we're seeing, which is like how we train and assess healthcare professionals, and basically combined my two life passions of video games and healthcare, and started Osso, and walked away from full-time clinical practice. But I am still able to see patients on weekends. Great. I'm like a part-time surgeon.
Right.
So at UCLA and Orthopedic Institute for Children, probably nothing my patients want to hear, but it's going great. I'm able to balance it.
So let's jump into Osso. Tell me a little bit about when you formed the company. What was the problem you were trying to solve, or the problem you are trying to solve?
So, I was in these cases at these top hospitals. People are flying from other countries to get surgeons from the best surgeons, best surgical teams. And people would turn to me once they're under anesthesia and be like, hey, Justin, can you Google real quick what to do? Like, we haven't done this before. We haven't done this in a while. I'm like, what is going on here? This is insane. So I kind of tried to understand a bit more, and kind of identified 4 core dynamics, I think, that are causing this problem. One is there's just way too much to learn. So if you think about it, accelerating science and technology is expanding the library of procedures we need to know how to do on demand.
Yeah.
It's like we've gone from French Laundry to Cheesecake Factory is one of my favorite analogies. You just can't do everything well.
Right.
Another extreme example, I was just sitting at lunch minding my own business, and we get a page, and it's the zoo, and they're like, we need you to drive down here to operate on Jabari, this gorilla, within the next hour. And we're like, you realize you're talking to human doctors, right? And they're like, you need to come. So we're driving to the zoo, we're Googling if gorillas have bones. But that went great. That was a wild surgery. We had to evacuate a few times. I have a lot of pictures later if you want to see.
I bet.
But to me, it was such a great analogy of what being a surgeon in today's day and age is like. It feels like we're dealing with a gorilla-like situation on a daily basis, just something we've never seen or you only see very rarely. Problem number 2 is modern surgery, things like robotics, minimally invasive surgery, is a lot harder to learn. People don't really talk about this too much, but learning curves have gone from maybe 10 to 20 cases to 50 to 100. So it's 10 times harder to learn these newer technologies. Number 3 is we really lack a way to objectively assess technical skills. So the only time I was really assessed for my ability to do surgery, I was asked to play the board game Operation and remove some pieces without buzzing, which I did. And I'm really proud of, and I told my mom, but it's that's kind of state of the art right now.
My
which is
son, the orthopedic surgeon.
I did it, Mom.
Yeah.
And then, finally, surgery's gone from this kind of individual sort of heroic sport, right? The surgeon's superhero comes in through the ceiling, does surgery and leaves, to much more of a team sport. It's become such a complex action, requires a lot of coordination and training as a team, yet we're only really training the surgeon, and the team itself is constantly rotating in and out, right? In a month, you're working with 25 different surgical techs, maybe 50 different anesthesiologists. So this is a big problem. So I got involved in VR at the very beginning and, put a headset on, and I'm like, oh my God, I could train surgeons with this. You can use it anytime, anywhere. You get objective assessment. You train as a team and train remotely and use your hands in a haptic enhanced way. So came up for this concept with Osso. which, interestingly, everyone at the time thought was like not a great idea. And you're like, oh, you're going to train surgeons with a video game? Yeah, good luck with that.
Right.
And so started the company in 2016 with the mission to improve patient outcomes, better education and assessment, increase the adoption of higher value surgical techniques, and democratize access to surgical training for everyone everywhere. And today we're the world's largest VR surgical training company, VR training company, whichever way you slice it.
Right. And that's amazing.
Kind of intended.
I just want to go back to the importance piece. So I think that the whole tradition of surgical training was based on demonstrating your competence through the operating room. I mean, you weren't. I was an internist, so I demonstrated my competence by taking care of somebody in a hospital bed. You basically did it in an operating room with a defined procedure. And the only way you could learn that procedure was actually by doing it, in the old see one, do one, teach one kind of philosophy. And before the introduction of all these advanced technologies, to your point, required a X number of cases before you sort of had competence. Now we insert this in these advanced surgical skills requires more touches in order to get competent. But yet at the same time, we're reducing the number of hours that trainees can actually experience these live cases. So unless there is something like a virtual reality trainer, we're not going to extend training. Basically, as educators, we've said we're not going to take an orthopedic surgical residency and expand it to 8, 9, or 10 years or whatever it's going to be. So there really is no other alternative than to do something like this, right?
I mean, there are so many problems with how we train proceduralists and surgeons. And yeah, like you can't just keep adding time. It's already gotten too long. And that's why you see numbers like 99% of people going on 2 extra years of training and fellowship. And, the idea of med school being 4 years, residency being 5 to 7, and then fellowship being 1 to 3. I mean, it could be 17, 18 years before you're considered an adult, right? With a job. That's
you're qualifying for Medicare at that point in time.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. And then I'm just worried that we're scaring off the best and the brightest.
Right.
But, they look at a career in technology and they look at a career in medicine. They're like, this doesn't make sense anymore to spend so much time. And so you're seeing some med schools slim down to 3 years. NYU is 3 years now. And I think with a technology like this, the reason why it takes so long is not that's what it takes. It's just, it's so inefficient that if we could train people more efficiently and standardize it, we may be able to get some people out sooner in what's called competency-based training and not time-based.
Right.
So I think another problem that people often aren't aware of, it's not like, okay, you're going to do your surgical training and you're going to do these cases in order. It's just whatever comes in through the door. It's random. So, one of my friends who was on his hand surgery rotation, one of the most common procedures we do is a distal radius open reduction internal fixation, or ORIF. And I guess no one fell off their skateboard or was hit by a car for those 2 months he was on the rotation. So he never did one. But that's a very important surgery to do. And so this is why it's you're getting a very inconsistent product coming out of medicine. Whereas you look at aviation, where everyone is doing a simulator every 6 months, reassessing themselves. They all have the same baseline. Yeah, they have different real world experience, but that sort of foundation gives you a very consistent, I know what I'm getting kind of feeling.
What's been the biggest challenge in growing this business for you?
I mean, everything's hard in startups, but I think probably the biggest challenge is change in medicine. People are conservative. It's been interesting to me that even when something works unbelievably well and you have an abundance of data to support it and you're not even really giving up anything to use it, there will still be resistance.
Yeah.
That being said, I am also surprised how quickly it's being adopted. I know those are two very opposite things, but I think the problem is so big and the technology solves it so well, and that there's this growing comfort with technology, especially in sort of the post-pandemic world, whatever you want to call it, that we're seeing really rapid adoption. We're training now about 5,000 healthcare professionals a month.
That's amazing. As you think about coming to a conference like this and running into potentially other investors, other people who might be interested in getting involved in technology and healthcare technology, if you were mentoring somebody, a young resident who said, gee, Justin, I kind of like your career path. What kind of advice do you have for me?
Don't. I would tell them to listen to our podcast.
There you go.
The Slice.
Right. Subscribe.
Yes.
And like.
You can download it anywhere you listen to podcasts.
That's right.
But we do, I had a very hard time wrestling with how to balance a clinical career with an entrepreneurial career, and settled in where I am, and I'm really happy. But there's no set path right now, and maybe there will be in the future. So I thought one of the most helpful things could be to tell people stories about, like, well, how did they make their decision? Some people will drop out of med school, like Shiv Gaglani at Osmosis. He took a break. I don't know if I'll ever get back to it, but he was very successful, and some people will not go to residency. Some people will drop out of residency. Some people will literally just do both. So it's different for everyone. It depends on the opportunity, what you want to do, your level of involvement, both entrepreneurship and clinical life and technology. So I would talk to as many people as possible and network here. But I think listening to people's stories can, you'll hear something, you're like, oh, that is what I want to do. Okay, that's a path I can take. And you can try and sort of align with that. Or maybe it can give you comfort that people had the exact same challenges that you did and you're not alone. But it's hard because medicine is very much a set, you go down this pathway, and deviations from it used to be very discouraged, right? Like if you had an MBA, you were seen as not being serious enough about medicine, and people thought it was a very bad thing. Now it's seen as slightly more positive, I think. So you're seeing a little bit of relaxation, but not a lot. And so you really have to carve your own path, and no one's going to tell you or that you can do this or give you a degree to do this. It's something that you have to just decide to do and make something from nothing. But that's literally the most opposite thing you could do, is someone who's spends a lot of time in medicine.
Right. So last question for you. As a physician who's now the CEO of a technology company, do you think your training prepared you for this? Do you think, because as I look at a lot of technology companies and I think about what a physician skill set really is, I think it's really hard for a physician to be a CEO of a startup. But I think there are certain niches, perhaps telehealth, where there's direct patient care involved in the technology startup, where the physician has experience with that. And in your case, medical education, where that was a huge part of your upbringing. To me, it makes a lot of sense to have a physician as a CEO of the company. But what are your thoughts in terms of a CEO or a physician as the CEO of a technology company?
Well, I think certainly from a product and commercial standpoint, it helps. To have the experience as a trained surgeon who's still seeing patients. But I think generally, if you just look at from an abstract perspective, a physician coming in as the CEO of a startup in particular, because I don't think a physician just walk in and be a CEO of a public company.
Right.
Maybe you can ease into that. There are certain things that I think actually worked extremely well, and some things that had to be unlearned for sure. I think things that work very well, we're trained to not sleep, to just constantly be stressed out and putting out fires. And it's that's what I'm used to. And so I feel very comfortable doing all of that. I think another thing that I didn't expect is a big part of running a team is dealing with life, right? It's so basic.
Yep.
And so when I talk to people on the team, everyone is shocked. They're like, oh my God, I've never had a boss or CEO I could talk to about these kind of things, which are not big things, by the way. Right. It's very basic. And the bar is so low. And we've become, in technology, in business, so disconnected from the human element that we just forgot how to talk to one another.
Yep.
And that's what we're trained to do.
Right.
And it's it's overkill, honestly. But that is something I think has been incredibly powerful. And I think also just being very easily able to connect that line to mission, right? It's I've seen it. I know that we can do this. Here's the light at the end of the tunnel. Let's go. Now, what didn't work well? The healthcare is a little backwards in a lot of ways, especially how teams are run, and especially in surgery. And it's very militaristic, and it's just hey, you do what I tell you immediately with no regard to your personal life or capacity. And it's order based and very hierarchical, and you just wait your turn, and all there's no bi-directional feedback and all these things. And so I came in with that attitude of hey, everyone has to wake up at 4 a.m. and
Yep.
You got to do rounds and be ready for this stuff and just do what I tell you. And I don't really care what you have to say. And very quickly you learn that hey, that it doesn't work well. I think another thing in medicine and surgery, we get a lot of crap from people for having huge egos,
Right.
which is annoying. But at the same time, when you're cutting someone open, I think you have to delude yourself
Right.
that you know what you're doing.
Right.
Because it is scary when you think about what's actually going on. So I think you do that for a while and you're wow, well, I could cut someone open. I could do anything. And you get this swagger and this confidence. It feels great. And then you walk into your first investor pitch and you get torn the F apart, and you realize, oh my God, I don't know anything. And that humility, like letting that in and be like, okay, I don't know everything, but I can learn, and I'm going to start from scratch again and open myself up like a med student and try and just get up to speed as fast as I can. I think a lot of people have trouble like coming in thinking they know everything. And especially not just from a CEO standpoint, but partnering with clinicians and healthcare professionals can be challenging because they bring incredible value, but maybe not as much as they think sometimes. And so you have to balance that kind of ego and confidence, which is important, but they need to be a part of the team.
Justin, I think if anybody can do it, I think you can. Not every physician can bring humility to the table. And I think what you just outlined in terms of being able to look inward and be a little introspective and to learn from that, I think that's really admirable. So thanks for joining us on the podcast
make me cry,
today.
Man. Thanks for having me. When can we come back?
Absolutely. I want to be on yours.
Come on by.
Cool. Thanks so
right.
much.
Awesome.